All right. We have so much to talk about today. I want to begin by recalling, of all things, a moment in the movie Annie Hall, where Alvy Singer, played by Woody Allen, and Annie Hall, played by Diane Keaton, are walking along, and the moment is coming in their relationship where somebody probably has to say, I love you, to the other person. And what Alvy, Woody Allen, says is that he thinks love is too weak a word. That he says, I love you. I love you. He tries saying it in a whole bunch of other ways. The point being that since everybody says I love you, he wants to say something else. And I think crisis is a little bit like that now. I mean, it's a less appetizing concept than love, but everything does feel like a crisis. We talk about crises all the time. And, you know, if I don't know, if there's a crisis in the birth rate of Japan and a pedestrian safety crisis in America and a humanitarian crisis in 5 or 6 areas of the world, you start wondering about the word itself and whether we would know a real crisis when we saw it. And some of those are real crises, obviously. Anyway, I've got to stop babbling and begin to talk to my guests. Eliah Bures is a historian of modern Europe and a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Right-Wing Studies. Christian Paz is a senior politics reporter for Vox. So we are going to begin with you, Eliah. You really did see this coming. You wrote that article in 2020 about whether if everything's a crisis, nothing's a crisis. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? I mean, these days, we've even kind of created sort of portmanteau words like polycrisis and permacrisis, and now there's something called crisis fatigue. And it almost feels like a little bit of a feedback loop. We keep telling people there's a crisis, and now they have crisis fatigue.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for having me. I agree. I think crisis is itself in crisis, ironically, a little bit. I mean, to talk, kind of start out with the origins of the term, it was quite a common term in ancient Greek. It kind of named stark alternatives, a moment of decision. So in law, it meant verdict. In the field of battle, it meant, the decisive turning point. Will we win? Will we lose? And then it becomes a politicized word, really, in the 18th century. It enters the field of society, and it comes to name the moment where there's a watershed, a turning point, where it will be decided whether or not society takes one course or another. And often it's cast in very existential terms. So the locus classicus of this is really Thomas Paine's famous 1776 essay, Common Sense, published, I think, tellingly in a magazine called The American Crisis, in which he's urging American colonists to stand up and fight for their liberty. In which case, if they do so, they will have a nation of their own. They will live in freedom, and if they don't, they will become slaves or continuous slaves to the British Crown. And so that's really the core sense of the word, is this narrative, this capacity to dramatize the present, to tell a story about a past that leads to the present diagnosed as a kind of crossroads or a watershed, a turning point, and then a turning point, in the present that will lead to one or two possible futures, either salvation or death, something very good or something very bad. And that's the core meaning. But in the 20th century, especially after World War I, that understanding of crisis, it begins to bleed into other domains. And so really, in the course of the 20th century, you can chart this very directly. Since 1900, at least in English language publications, instances of the word crisis have escalated. I think increased about 450%, so more than quadrupled. Yeah, and it's come to just, it feeds into everything's in crisis. Right. And I think part of its power is its ability to dramatize the present in this way.
Yeah, I think now everybody feels like they're having a crisis. We'll be talking at the end of the show with Barbara Bradley Haggerty about the idea of a midlife crisis. We'll be talking in the middle part of the show to someone who handles PR crises. I mean, Hugh Grant had a PR crisis, not the same kind of crisis that the pandemic or Ukraine were. I did actually find a speech given by the managing director of the International Monetary Fund in 2022 where she talked about Ukraine and the pandemic and said that what we have, in effect, she says, to put it simply, we are facing a crisis on top of a crisis. I think it might be interesting to hear a little bit of what a crisis sounds like a real crisis. And interestingly, what we're going to play is the sound of somebody sounding extraordinarily calm in the middle of a crisis. This is A1 Cat.
So we then got this message this morning So we now have to wait to see how it unfolds, and there's a good deal of complexities to it. If the withdrawal of these missiles, technicians, and the cessation of subversive activity by them, well, we just have to set up satisfactory procedures to determine whether these actions will be carried out. So I would think that if we can do that, we'll find our interests advanced, even though it may be only one more chapter in a rather long story as far as Cuba is concerned.
Of course, that's JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody ever calls it anything else. Cuban Missile leads to the word crisis. It's not the Cuban Missile Misunderstanding or the Cuban Missile Diplomacy Victory or anything else. And he's talking to Eisenhower there. And if I were president, I would have been crying about halfway through the phone call. I'd be saying, I think the world's going to blow up and it's going to be my fault. Please come back and be president. I can't do this. But he sounds so unbelievably calm. But I mean, to your point, Eliah, that's a real crisis, particularly in the sense that it could go really, really horribly or it could go a lot better. It is that sort of fork in the road moment that defines a real crisis.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the, I think, truly legitimate uses of crisis are these sorts of, crises in international affairs where, war and peace are at stake. And, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear holocaust, a nuclear exchange between superpowers or not. I mean, I think that's a very legitimate use of the word. But what's interesting to me about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that unlike most uses of crisis today, it's bounded in time. The chronology is very clear. It unfolded over 13 days in October 1962. Nobody thinks it began in 1957. Nobody thinks it lasted until the 1970s. It's clearly bounded in time, whereas most of our uses of crises today are much fuzzier, much vaguer chronologically. So, if there's a crisis at the border, a crisis in education, if there's an opioid crisis, I mean, these are, I think maybe arguable uses of the word crisis, but when did they begin? What was the threshold at which we entered the period, the state of crisis in these fields? It's much fuzzier. And because it's much fuzzier, I think it's much more prone to rhetorical abuse. It's much more prone to mischief of various sorts.
So let's bring Christian into this conversation. We want young voters to be engaged. We want millennials and Zoomers to care about the electoral process. But we also keep telling them there's a crisis. A crisis is not something that's a very inviting prospect. Could you say a little bit about how you see that in terms of promoting the engagement, particularly of younger people, with the political process, with public policy, with the news in general?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that we talk about the fuzziness of crises today because I think it definitely speaks to one of the big distinctions between something that's time-bound and something that's definitive in terms of life and death, because what we're really talking about in the fuzzier aspect is a version of an identity crisis or a version of a threat to some kind of status quo or the appearance of a status threat. And that really, I feel, comes across when we're thinking about young people specifically and the kind of politics that they've been exposed to over the last 20 years as they've entered and matured into political age is the crises that we talk about in politics, leave the economic aside, tend to have to do with crises of American identity, crises of American government, of legitimacy, of representation, and really essentially, struggles over how power should be used. And that's kind of fed into a version of political speech that we have now that has definitely been more Manichaean, has definitely set up elections in terms of this all or nothing. I think if you were to ask a young person, not necessarily a new voter, but somebody who might have voted in one presidential election or two, you ask them, how has this election or how was that election described to you? They'll probably say, oh, I was told that it was the most important election of my lifetime. And how many times have we heard that? Probably pretty frequently. And usually that's because the election is being described to them and politics is being described to them, not in terms of incrementalism or in terms of slope, progress or in terms of actual concrete legislative achievements, but in terms of a kind of moral and identitarian face-off between a worldview that maybe you believe in, and a worldview that's trying to take that power or fundamentally reshape the status quo. And I think even going back to what I think is the prime example of a politician who used the language of crises and kind of was able to mobilize a movement. You go back to 2008, Barack Obama did something in politics that was just kind of unseen at the time, and becoming a kind of generational figure for millennials and eventually for Gen Z as well. But the stakes being raised obviously high there because Iraq War, Afghanistan, financial crises. There were a lot of things going on there that kind of made sense. But since then, that kind of usage of that kind of totalizing language has kind of stuck around in politics, definitely through Trump and to today.
Yeah. Let's go back to Obama for a second, because I think that's a really good point. That one of the sort of slangy terms for him was eventually "no drama Obama," and I think if you think about that '08 election, it was in the middle of the economic crisis, as you said, and there really was kind of a moment where you could tell. It might have been Lehman Brothers. I can't remember. One of the big collapses happened, and there was a question about whether McCain and Obama were still going to have a debate. And you just suddenly realized that Obama seemed pretty calm about this whole thing. Like he thought he could probably figure out how to get through this. And McCain seemed a little bit more confused. And to me, it was one of the moments in that election cycle where you thought, because people were really scared. I mean, they really thought they were headed to another Great Depression instead of a Great Recession. And you needed the feeling that it wasn't a crisis in order to feel good at all. And I'm thinking, Christian, that may have been one of Obama's gifts.
Definitely. And I think it's something that many tried to replicate since then and couldn't, or they went the Trump route, essentially, which is to exploit it even more, and to try to I just think back to the American Carnage speech that Donald Trump gave at his inauguration. But it does feed into, I think, a bit of what we have had since, when you ask about young people specifically, which is they're obviously becoming a bigger part of the electorate. But at the same time, I think you look historically, Gallup has some research on this about how news attention, which tends to spike in what we might think of as moments of crises, has dropped significantly across the electorate, but especially among younger people. That 18 to 29 demographic that over the last 20 years, maybe I think Gallup cites about 16% of them as the average who would say that they closely follow political news, has now, in 2023, dropped to 9%. So a pretty significant drop-off, which maybe speaks to a bit of fatigue with all this talk of crises and us versus them.
Yeah, no, it's, documentable. A Pew Research Center survey last year found that 65% of Americans said they always or often felt exhausted when they thought about politics. But, Elias, back to what we were saying before, and Elias, I think this really kind of, I want to build on what Christian said about Obama, because there's an opposite mode that you write about in your essay. And it's Trump, it's Putin, it's Orban, and Obama is sort of saying, yeah, there's a crisis. This kind of sucks, but I got this. We'll figure this out. And then you've got these other kinds of leaders who say there's a crisis, and then, in Trump's words, and I alone can save you. This is something that you wrote about, that the authoritarian style is to say exactly that. There's a crisis, and I alone can save you.
Yeah, that's part of my suspicion about the word crisis and its overuse. I think ultimately the politics of this word may bend more favorably to the authoritarian right than in any other direction. And the contrast with Obama is stark. I mean, Obama famously said there's no blue America, there's no red America, there's a United States of America. Whereas Trump and others of I think more illiberal bent around the world, you mentioned Orban, you mentioned Putin, tend to cast crisis as a deep, dire threat to national identity, and a threat, crucially, that's been created on the left. The kind of stories they tell me, it's almost a common theme, connecting these various illiberal actors today around the world is a common kind of deep story of their nation's victimhood at the hands of liberal elites, Western elites, progressive elites. The terms are many, wokeism, political correctness, things like this, but it's a common deep story, I think, that connects them all.
Yeah, and Christian, as we look at this cycle, you probably saw the same New York Times article that I did. I think it was by Katie Gluck, saying that people who were opposed to Trump were starting to feel, and this is a direct quote from one of them, "crisis out." And one sort of wonders about that. You've already kind of alluded to it, Christian, but in this cycle, crisis talk might really just dampen enthusiasm in general. And it seems as though maybe we're even hearing a little bit less crisis talk from Trump himself, and certainly not hearing it from Biden about anything except the possibility of Trump getting elected. But yeah, what are your thoughts there?
That's absolutely true, that contrast. I mean, in general, an incumbent doesn't necessarily want to acknowledge that there is a crisis going on, because that would mean that they are not right. They're scoring an own goal there. But it is interesting in the sense of how Trump has managed to, honestly, in a very, this may be hard to believe, but he hasn't been the totalizing force that he was in 2020 or 2016, the kind of the central figure in national discourse and in media coverage. His indictments, his court appearances, the decisions that have come down from some of those civil trials, they have been big news, but they've tended to be kind of washed out by other things that are going on in politics, and not been kind of what we were used to 24-hour coverage of him in ahead of the 2016 election, maybe. And part of that is a factor that he and his campaign have chosen to remain in pretty conservative echo chambers, whether that's giving speeches at CPAC or in red states or at specific Republican events, or kind of not really giving using the same even kind of rhetoric that he used to use before. It's kind of evolved a little bit, and a lot of that has kind of been the absence of him from social media, from Twitter specifically, and on Truth Social. But it's interesting to talk about that kind of crisis, burnout, Trump fatigue, because it is also kind of the product of a Democratic Party that for a long time has seen itself as only really able to score, kind of make offensive ground when there is a crisis. You think about Dobbs and the overturn of Roe v. Wade. That was definitely described in the language of crisis, and a cousin of it being the term unprecedented. And it was obviously a significant, pretty significant historic moment, and that was what gave Democrats the energy to push through the 2022 midterms, and it's kind of fed a bit of the president's reelection plan. I think I remember writing about his State of the Union last year, and the big kind of takeaway from that State of the Union was that President Biden was offering an alternative to just an anti-Trump campaign. He was kind of offering an optimistic message, a hopeful message of recovering from the pandemic, of economic growth, of slowing inflation bit by bit, and then laid out kind of an issue-based agenda for things that he wanted to attention and to focus on. And since then, I guess the combination of the economy's slow stabilization, still not turning into positive approval ratings, and also Gaza and Israel-Palestine becoming an issue again, with Ukraine dragging on, and Trump getting indicted, and all these other specific Trump legal situations have kind of drawn that campaign back into anti-Trump mode instead of that positive, uplifting message that they might have had a chance to do. And that, I think, is just completely inseparable from this Trump and crisis fatigue, which is people, it seems, in a lot of the polling that I've looked at, are kind of tired of thinking about these two men. They're tired of thinking about movements, and maybe want to think about specific issues and priorities that they might have.
Yeah, I think we should not completely exonerate ourselves here in the press. In fact, one thing that I've noticed, I've done it myself actually, but a tendency, because crisis is no longer as good a word as it used to be, we now refer to this election as existential in nature. Of course, we know what follows existential. The crisis is probably the word that follows the word existential most often. But it's just not good enough for it to be a crisis. It has to be existential. So, Eliah, you end your piece, I mean, it's running through your piece, but you end your piece talking about the Weimar Republic and the idea that fear and desperation, rather than the actual material conditions on the ground, the fear and the desperation seem to drive Weimar towards its end, towards its turn towards authoritarianism. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you see that. And whether, as you hear Christian talk about just the fatigue of people dealing with a pervasive sense of never-ending crisis, whether that's similar or significantly different.
Well, maybe to start with the latter point, the feeling of paralysis or crisis fatigue, that itself is not particularly new, I don't think. I mean, I'm reminded of Jimmy Carter's famous crisis of confidence speech in July 1979, which is another kind of crisis of crisis diagnosis, in the sense that what he's talking about is a loss of optimism, a loss of belief in our capacity to master the world around us and to build a better future. I mean, what he's talking about is we now face crisis without believing that we can handle it, that we can manage it, and I mean, there's a kind of there's a kind of paralysis in that, but I think still fundamentally today it's not about people who talk about crisis, they want action. It's a call to mobilization.
Yeah. That's the famous Melez speech in which he never says Melez. It's actually a better speech than I remember. I went back to it recently. It's not that bad at all. Well, listen, we have to go to a break right here. You guys have been just terrific, and you've really set the table for the rest of our conversation. Eliah Bures, historian of modern Europe and a senior fellow at the University of California's Berkeley's Center for Right-Wing Studies. Christian Paz is a senior politics reporter for Vox. We're going to come back and talk to the person who you going to call when you're having a very public crisis. Molly McPherson.
The Reynolds pamphlet. Have you read this? Alexander Hamilton had a torrent affair, and he wrote it down right there. Highlights.
The charge against me is a connection with one James Reynolds for purposes of improper speculation. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife for a considerable time with his knowing consent. I had frequent meetings with her. Most of them in my
See, this is the kind of thing that Molly McPherson gets called in to deal with. Although the first thing she would say to Alexander Hamilton is, "You wrote it down and published it? I might not be able to help you." Molly McPherson is an expert in crisis communications and emergency management. She's the author of the book, Indestructible: Reclaim Control and Respond with Confidence in a Media Crisis. I've also been listening to her very entertaining and interesting podcast today. She's also a superstar on TikTok. And so she's here with us. Hi, Molly McPherson.
Hello, Colin.
So, yes, the word crisis. I mean, in the first segment of the show today, we talked about a crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where if you get things wrong, a lot of things blow up and people die, and it's a very, very serious problem for the entire world. There are other kinds of crises. I mean, and some of them are reputational in nature, and they're really more of a crisis for the person and people close to the person, and that's often where you come in. And maybe just say about how you think of the word crisis in that situation.
Well, I think of the word crisis, straight from theory and from the textbook. It can be defined as a significant threat, either to your operations or a reputation. So if you do not handle it properly, there will be negative effects.
So, I think I want to go over some of the mistakes I think people make. The first one being not calling Molly McPherson, of course. But I also wonder if Hugh Grant made people think that this was easier than it really is. If you recall, in 1995, he gets caught involved with a sex worker. I think it was in L.A., and it's a huge thing. And it's, his career's really kind of getting started there. And this was back when maybe we were a little less accustomed to a constant flood of scandals than we are right now. But it really was a PR crisis. And one of the things I guess that he and his PR team decided to do was just go on late night talk shows and talk and talk and talk and used that aw shucks Hugh Grant charm. And he really got out of this without much of a scratch or dent. And I wonder, Molly, if other people who've been in crises since then have thought, well, he did it. Why couldn't I do it?
Well, the problem is that not enough people remember the Hugh Grant incident. And even though that was back in the 90s, that was a brilliant response to a celebrity scandal. And the fact that so many people do the complete opposite as a Hugh Grant. I mean, he played the character of Hugh Grant, that kind of foppish, cute, sweet guy who in real life isn't really like that. But he was a caricature that absolutely worked. But people do not follow that playbook anymore.
Another thing that people do is that they think they can get through it alone, or they have people like you, but they don't listen to those people. I'm going to play a little example of that, which you are very, very familiar with. I promise we will not play the entire 10 minutes of this, but we'll just play a few seconds of this. This is B1 Cat.
Hey, it's been a while since you saw my face. I haven't been doing so great, so I took a little break. So a lot of people are saying some things about me that aren't quite true. Doesn't matter if it's true, though, just as long as it's entertaining to you. Right? You guys having fun? All aboard the toxic gossip train.
Oh, I think that's quite enough. Although pretty somewhere in that, Molly, this is Colleen Ballinger. You can maybe explain better than I can who she is and what kind of trouble she was in. But interestingly, I think at one point in that 10-minute YouTube musical thing, she said that they told me not to talk about this, but they didn't tell me I couldn't sing. And so that's why she's doing it. And you're just thinking, yeah, no, they meant that too. This is not a good idea.
Yes, I call that the too cute by half crisis response. She truly thought that she was going to, be more clever than the general public. Now, one might argue that that was straight out of that Hugh Grant playbook. I mean, she's playing a character, and she thought that character would come out on top by being clever and witty and to sing it through. But that was received as a complete flop of a response.
Yeah, and Molly, we should also say that one other way that we're in a different era from 1995 and Hugh Grant is when you do something like that, people start making their own TikToks and YouTube videos about what you just did. They don't even get through all 10 minutes of it before they just start pouring out responses. You don't have to wait for Inside Edition or an appearance on the Jay Leno show. It just happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And the difference too with Hugh Grant is, let's say that Hugh Grant story happened now. We wouldn't just find out about it on, Inside Edition, and then he'd go on Jay Leno, he'd go on the Tonight Show. There would probably be, 500 people in Los Angeles who were there on the street with Hugh Grant. They were filming him, they're interviewing, and they're all coming up with their own theories. I mean, they probably would have destroyed his reputation before he even got to the chair, with Jay to talk about it. But the Colleen Ballinger, is another example of when someone is, trying to, outwit, or out-strategize, the general public. That's where they tend to go south, because unlike a time when, when handlers and lawyers could control the media and control editors a little bit more, no one can control the public. No one can control public opinion. So you really have to tread lightly in these crisis responses.
Yeah, and also, when somebody's dealing with you, I mean, I think particularly in this era where we have people who are TikTok celebrities and Instagram influencers and viral YouTube personalities, Colleen Ballinger, who, by the way, I think was sort of in trouble with kind of, things involving underage people.
Yes, yes. It got dark.
That's what that song was about. But these are people who, how they got famous was just to try to be as interesting as they possibly could be and try to be as attention-getting as they possibly could be. And then I assume sometimes, Molly, you're talking to these people saying, no, you need to become really boring for a while. You don't want to be an interesting person. And that goes so much against their grain, right?
Oh, absolutely, Colin. I mean, these are people who are so accustomed to feeding off of their audiences. So when you get younger people, younger generations who are in the middle of a crisis, and I deal with them a lot now. I work with influencers, people who lose all their brand deals because they said something or did something wrong and the public decided that they were going to just inflict all this backlash on their brain. I mean, they panic and they don't know what to do with it. But people forget that if you just use truth, if you just, use common sense and you give the public what they want, which is an acknowledgement of what you did wrong, and then they'll quickly move on. But if you fight it, they are going to continue to fight you until you get to the point where you have to say something or your career is completely over.
Yeah, now that I'm a full-blown McPhersonite, I know that what you have to do is you have to own it, and then you have to explain it, and then you have to promise that you have a strategy for making sure it does not happen again.
That's it. That's the full-blown playbook. You got it right there.
I don't have to pay you anymore. I can just do this every time I get in trouble.
Yes.
So, but another point that you've made, which I think is also a really good one, is that there's a normal human instinct to fight back, particularly if you feel like, that maybe you have done something wrong, but the way that it's being described strikes you as grotesquely unfair. And so a lot of people want to fight back. And I assume that's something that you also often are trying to talk them out of doing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, my duty to the profession means it's a duty to my client. And I want my client to be able to get through this crisis. And I tell them, if you start by explaining what happened, which is what most people want to do, that is the natural human reaction. When someone inflicts pain, you want to, you need to explain it. You're bracing yourself out there. But the problem when you start explaining, eventually people just naturally fall into blaming other people. They naturally want to explain themselves out of it. And it gets worse. And it becomes this cycle of doom almost. I tell them, just stop what you're doing first and just take accountability. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to apologize. It doesn't mean you have to say you're sorry. Sometimes you're just adjacent to the crisis. Sometimes people just want an explanation of what happened. So simply addressing what happened can help in many cases.
Absolutely. I think I heard you make a point that I thought was a terrific point, and that was about the difference between a legal fixer and a PR fixer. So a legal fixer is Michael Clayton, George Clooney. This is the guy who comes in and tries to get you out of the trouble that you're in. What he's really worried about is your judicial exposure here, the fact that the idea that you could be indicted, you could be convicted, and so he or she will do whatever is necessary to get you out of that. And that, you used the example of Jonathan Majors, and I thought it was a good one. That's maybe the opposite of what you want the same client to do in terms of public relations.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan Majors, Lizzo, those are two people following the same playbook where they are listening to lawyers over a crisis manager, if you will, or a handler. Lawyers act as crisis managers in these situations, but they're putting legal liability first. Now, that could win the day for them. I mean, they could get out of whatever court snafu they have. However, it comes with a great risk to your reputation. And when the public, the general public, and more damaging when the social media public determines that you are hypocritical or that you are denying something that you shouldn't be denying, you're going to have a liability anyway, and that's to your reputation and ultimately your career.
Yeah, so it is like blaming the victim might be an effective strategy in certain kinds of legal jeopardies, but blaming the victim in a situation where your reputational jeopardy is what's on the line is usually a pretty bad strategy, which is why I guess you need a team, actually. So yeah, I think the other thing to say about this, and this is, so I've been a journalist for 47 years, and so I've had an opportunity to watch a lot of this. And one of the things that I always think is that from our point of view, from the journalist point of view, what we love is when somebody who's in trouble doesn't make a clean breast of things in the first place. They don't own it and explain it. And so then there's that drip, drip, drip. There's and so that means it's sort of full employment for us, right? We're wondering, how long can we ride this story? Well, sometimes they make it easy for us. They just break the story into little pieces and keep feeding them to us.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm fortunate because my +1 in my life is a journalist. So I always get to see those sides of the stories. And so when he's telling me about situations where I'm watching, a newscast, when I see someone right away come out and admit it, and it just kind of own that conversation, you can almost see like how he wilts, when he sees that, because journalists don't want that. It's the end of the story, it's done and over with. But me in crisis management, that's the trick. I mean, most people are so afraid to do that, but I tell them, hey, you guys, this is the secret. If you say this, like, not only will the public give you a break, the journalist is going to have nowhere to go. There's no other part of the story. And yeah, they may finish it and it might be, a story comes out of it, but it's not a great story. So that's what my goal is when I'm working with clients. I'm sorry, Colin.
No, I know, I get it. But I mean, we've all, occasionally we watch that clip of Bill Clinton going, I did not have sexual relationships with that woman. And you're just thinking, do people never learn?
They never learn. But you know what, though, with President Clinton, how in a million years did he ever think that a blue dress would exist? That's why what he was doing, he was playing the odds. Because if there wasn't a dress, he would have gotten away with it because he was so charismatic. He had a base. He had people who supported him. But it was him against Monica Lewinsky. But in the end, it was him against a dress, and he could not beat the dress.
Yeah, and just real quick, because we're running out of time here, but though I could talk to you a lot longer. I wonder if you think that Trump has kind of rearranged the DNA of this whole thing, in the sense that, the Access Hollywood tape, I'm sure your plus one says this too, that should have been the end of the campaign. In conventional, timelines, the conventional narrative of American political life, that's the end of your political campaign. Mike Pence is running for president. And somehow it wasn't. And I wonder whether our understanding of the word crisis, and particularly public relation or reputational crisis, changed as a result of that, or is he just so sui generis, such a one-off, that it doesn't really affect anything else?
Well, great question. And what I'm noticing in my work is specifically in the past year is we're dealing with polarization now. When you have polarization, when you have a base, you can start making those types of risk and saying those things. And former President Trump knows this. We look at what happened with Bud Light. Here was an absolutely huge operational crisis that happened there, but they chose to abandon segments of consumerism, which is really normally that would be a death knell to a brand, but they doubled down on it and they got through that because there is so much polarization. So absolutely, that shakes up the playbook a lot nowadays.
All right. Well, Molly McPherson, you are a joy to talk to. You're also certainly on my speed dial now for the minute the whole thing about me and the lemurs comes out. So Molly McPherson is an expert in crisis communications, the author of the book, Indestructible, Reclaim Control and Respond with Confidence in a Media Crisis. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the midlife crisis, which sometimes precipitates Molly's kinds of crises.
You've got to spread joy up to the maximum, bring gloom down to the minimum. Have faith or pandemonium's liable to walk upon the scene. To illustrate my last remark, Jonah in the whale, Noah in the ark. What did they do just when...
Make sure you never miss the Colin McEnroe Show by subscribing to or following our podcast on any app. It is free. The senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show is Lily Tyson, whose boss is Katie Tolarski, whose boss is Mark Contreras, who reports to the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. We don't know why. Back to the show.
And we are indeed back. Time to thank Kat Pastor, our technical producer. That was her voice there doing the credits too. And the aforementioned Lily Tyson, the senior producer of our show, is the producer of this particular episode. Also thanks to Existential Bob, a stuffed toy who I've placed on her desk a long time ago. Existential Crisis Bob is his name, actually. And thanks to Jonathan McPants, who's been running around grabbing some of the clips that we've used today as well. I think that's everybody. Now, this is so exciting. This is like a celebrity for me. I'm a public radio guy. For years, I listened to Barbara Bradley Haggerty, particularly talking about religion, now a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and the author of Life Reimagined, The Science, Art, and Opportunity of Midlife. Barbara Bradley Haggerty, welcome to our show.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Colin.
So we can talk a little bit about the history of this idea of the midlife crisis. I want to just say that one thing that I discovered today in my research is that the German term is Torschlusspanik, literally shut door panic, fear of being on the wrong side of the closing gate. But this is an idea that sat around for a while, and then a guy at Yale named Daniel Levinson sort of breathed quite a bit of life into it. You can say a little bit about that.
Sure. It actually preceded Daniel Levinson. It was the idea of midlife crisis came from a psychoanalyst in Canada named Eliah Jacques, and he wrote this really obscure journal article in 1965, which was called Death and the Midlife Crisis. So here's what he did. He analyzed his own patients, all men, by the way, and he concluded that when a man begins to kind of glimpse the shadows of death, maybe in the 40s, he suddenly realizes that he will long be gone before he can realize his dreams. And so he has a midlife crisis. And then Daniel Levinson at Yale came along and picked up the theme after interviewing 40 men. And then the person who really put it on the map was Gail Sheehy, who wrote the book Passages, if you'll recall that. And suddenly the midlife crisis became, a cultural phenomenon. Everyone felt that they had to have a midlife crisis. But Colin, what happened is about 30 years ago, researchers tried to find evidence of a midlife crisis. They were like, yeah, let's just interview a whole bunch of people and kind of understand this crisis a little bit better. And what they found is that basically only 10% of people suffer this kind of crisis, this existential crisis, right? What most people refer to as a midlife crisis is really a crisis or a setback that happens in midlife, like losing a spouse or a parent or a job, having a health scare. Most people recover from those setbacks, but they don't have a midlife crisis. They have kind of a midlife ennui.
Right. So meanwhile, the culture is telling us otherwise. Gail Sheehy, as you say, in particular, is telling us otherwise. And Passages was a huge best-selling book. But we also started to see movies like American Beauty. Let's hear a little bit of Kevin Spacey, who has suddenly taken up jogging, and he inserts himself into a pair of regular joggers. See one cat.
Hey, guys.
Lester, I didn't know you ran.
Well, I just started. Good for you. I figured you guys might be able to give me some pointers. I need to shape up fast.
Are you looking to just lose weight, or do you want to have increased strength and flexibility as well?
Hey, I want to look good naked.
I mean, obviously, we don't even need to say. I mean, of course, with Kevin Spacey, that's kind of taken on a whole new set of meanings, but we won't go there. But yeah, I mean, I remember turning 40, and I remember thinking that if there were things that I was going to regret not doing towards the end of my life, I should maybe start doing them now. And that can either be a very healthy, almost evolutionarily determined moment of, let's think about that. Let's take a little inventory. Are there ways in which I'm not completely satisfying my goals for myself? Or it could be a big freaking mess. But I guess what you're saying is the research says it's not usually a big freaking mess.
It's not a big freaking mess. But what does happen, let me just mention something, because what people feel is actually a very real phenomenon. It's called the U curve of happiness. So researchers have interviewed people across the world, around the world, 70 different countries. And what they have found is that there's what they call the U curve of happiness. And here's what happens. In your 20s, you're young, you're filled with dreams. Oh, I could launch a startup, I can win an Oscar, I can find the cure for cancer. Then the 30s, you're married, maybe little kids, reality's beginning to sink in, like you're not going to be able to do all that stuff. And then in your 40s and 50s, you may have children or aging parents, heavy responsibilities at work, a mortgage, college tuition, and you know that you're not going to be able to accomplish those super heady dreams of your youth. So what happens is people kind of fall into a funk. And the low point for people in the United States is 45. It's 40 for women and 50 for men. And so this is a real phenomenon. But here's what happens. Eventually, and this is universal around the world, except for Russia, actually, around the world, you almost inevitably become cheerier in your 50s and 60s and 70s. And so a man on a walker in his, late 70s is happier than a man like Kevin Spacey at 45, right? Trying to look good naked. And one theory about this is that people begin to reconcile themselves to the fact that they're not going to be a CEO or a Supreme Court justice, and they begin to appreciate their lives and the people in their lives. But also brain studies show that your brain simply becomes happier after 50. It basically begins to look at the glass half full instead of half empty. And so what happens is there's this nadir, yes, in your 40s, but it's also a time of rich meaning, a lot of relationships. You're at the top of your game, career-wise and all of that stuff. So it's a meaningful time. It's just a really hard time.
I have to say that people tend to get happier, except in Russia, is probably the funniest thing anybody said on my show in weeks.
Well, can I tell you what happened? They looked at Russians, and what they found was that Russians get happier when they're 18, and then after that, it's all downhill.
So this is something for which we probably don't have the kind of hard-edged research that you prefer, but I think we can talk about it heuristically. I do think that the climate, the environment has changed quite a bit, and you start hearing acronyms like YOLO, you only live once, and FOMO, fear of missing out, and you realize that there's an entire huge multi-generational cohort of our species that have grown up in a somewhat different environment where they're constantly being invited to compare themselves to other people. Other people are showboating happiness on various social media platforms. Look what I'm doing. Look at my beautiful life. The implication inevitably being, which is not what your life is like. And I wonder, if this conversation were taking place 25 years from now, we might be talking about a different thing. People don't have a lot of chances just to sit with their lives and not have it be compared to a bunch of other shiny, beautiful lives.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we're in a really different time. I mean, you hear about the quarter life crisis, right? Mm-hmm. Where people 25 having an existential crisis or something, and that didn't happen when you and I'm about your age. I think that didn't happen when we were 25, and I think part of it is kind of looking at the outside world and seeing everyone putting on a terrific show and realizing that their outsides are not like your insides. But I also think that there's something external going on too, which is that this cohort, this younger group, it's putting off things such that there's a little bit more uncertainty in their lives. There's more existential angst. They're putting off marriage, so they're not getting families. They're not kind of forming that unit. They feel more alone. The economy, is a gig economy. There's been uncertainty in the economy. And so I think this kind of uncertainty is also feeding into this angst that people have, along with just thinking that they don't measure up to everyone else because, look at that page, look at, what a star they are. And so I think that is going on as well.
So we've got about 45 seconds left. As a public radio person, you really know what that means to say 45 seconds. Yes. There are 2 wonder drugs that people can take. One of them is called friendship. The other one's called purpose in life. Can you just kind of quickly give us that?
Sure. Friendship, everyone understands. The thing about friendship is that it's different from family in that when a friend stresses you out, you can distance yourself, whereas when a family member stresses you out or an in-law, you can't. And so friendships are really important. The other thing is having a reason to get up in the morning every day, whether it's a little purpose like, learning Spanish or for me, competitive cycling, that really helps you kind of wake up and feel enlivened, and having also a bigger purpose, which is to think about how can I use my talents, my experience, everything, my passions to bring meaning into my life and to do something that is not just about my own furtherment, to get richer or to get more famous or whatever. So those things, having a purpose, an internal purpose, that is super, super important.
Yes, I had a knee replacement, and now I'm very involved in competitive limping, and it's very rewarding. Barbara Bradley Haggerty is a contributing writer to The Atlantic, author of Life Reimagined, The Science, Art, and Opportunity of Midlife. We got to go. Thanks to everybody.
And it's all